Hello.
Okay, I think we're live. Wow, feels like democracy now. Okay, Erica, do you want to wait a couple minutes or should we get started?
Let's wait another minute or two just to see if others come and join. All right. Shall we get started?
Yeah, I think we can get started. Cool. Okay, you want to kick us off, Erica?
Fantastic. Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming to join us this afternoon or evening, wherever you might be. Um, Diana, do you want to talk about the mission and the purpose of this webinar?
Yeah, sure. Thanks everyone for joining. We wanted to host a webinar that was very open to everyone to just get a basic understanding of the Paris Agreement that is on the table right now and what's up for negotiation as we're a week away from COP. And so we wanted to create this platform and invite everyone to have this conversation with us. And you can, if you're on the Hangout with us, you'll be able to chat questions right off to the side. And then otherwise, you can also tweet us at SustainUS Agent. And Erica and I want to take just about 25 to 30 minutes to walk through some of what we're tracking and paying attention to in this treaty and the basic structure of it. And then we'll have more time also for questions as well. But for intros, we should also go into, I'm Dyanna, and I'm co-leading our delegation this year. I joined SustainUS last year on our COP20 delegation to Lima, and have been closely following the process this year and was able to go to the last 2 rounds of negotiation that took place here in Europe, in Germany, and I'm currently living in Paris, prepping for COP21. Erica, you want to give us an intro?
Sure. So my name is Erica. I joined SustainUS also around the same time a year ago. Went to COP20 in Lima, and this year I'm spearheading part of our policy campaign, specifically focused on loss and damage. We'll get more into that later. But I'm currently living at Oxford and studying here, working primarily on disaster and climate change related displacement and forced migration. Um, so without any further ado, um, SustainUS, more broadly, is U.S. Youth for Justice and Sustainability. And if you have any further questions about what the organization does, we'd be more than happy to answer those at the end. Dyanna, would you like to kick us off with a bit of a summary of why we have a treaty in 2015?
Yeah. So to answer that, we'll take it back to 1992, which was the year I was born, and this is going to be a quick 101 of international climate policy. The UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, got started in 1992, coming out of the Rio Earth Summit, and a really important development that was part of the creation of the UNFCCC was the creation of essentially 3 buckets of countries. And want to get this on the table now because it plays into the entire conversation of how and why we have a treaty right now. Those 3 buckets are Annex 1 countries, Annex 2 countries, and then what we call non-Annex countries. Annex 1 is the combination of the most industrialized countries and then the countries that were identified to be economies in transition at the time. And Annex 2 is only those most industrialized countries, which were determined by being members of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And then the non-Annex countries are just everyone else. And so that was set into place as kind of the base of the development of international climate policy in 1992. And then the first big stab at an international agreement was the famous Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed to in 1997 and really operationalized those annexes and put very specific things that were done by the Annex 1 and 2 countries and much less being done by the non-annexed countries on the basis of historical responsibility and who should be acting to respond to the climate crisis. But in huge response to that, the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol, didn't join, and following their lead, Japan and Canada both left, and by mid-2000s, the Kyoto Protocol was covering 14% of global emissions. So fast forwarding then to the next big attempt for climate agreement was in Copenhagen, which was called Copenhagen, and a big failure of the negotiations, very much looked as one of the lowest points of international climate policy. Of the negotiations essentially disbanded without agreement, and countries came back the next year in 2010 and said, okay, we can agree to this idea of voluntary pledges. So we didn't achieve a new climate regime that was strong, what people hoped, but it created this space of voluntary pledges that all countries were coming forward with saying, like, hey, this is what I can do. And so by 2011, you had these two different types of policy that were both in operation. One that was very top-down was the Kyoto Protocol, which we still are using today, and then these Copenhagen or post-Copenhagen and voluntary pledges that came out of 2010. And so you have these two very different kinds of policy, neither of them getting the job done by 2011. And it was in that year that a big decision was made together that we need to have a universal agreement that applies to all countries and is going to take force after the last endpoint of the Kyoto Protocol and after the endpoint of these voluntary pledges, which is in 2020 at the latest. And that's where we are today. So now we're at that now 4 years later after that decision was made in 2011, and working with the ADP, which came out of the 2011 decision, the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, and the very last round of negotiations of this 4-year process to agree to an agreement for that will take effect in 2020. And yeah, that's my brief overview. And Erica will tell us now more about what's happened this year, which has been really the year to create the text itself for this treaty that will be agreed to in about 3 weeks' time.
So how did we get to where we are now? Since Lima last December, there has been a process of negotiations that began last February when all parties met in Geneva. All the countries put forward what they wanted in this treaty in an ideal world. This document came out to be about 89 pages, was enormous, contained many, many, many options for every single article. And the challenge for the year was to cut down and to refine those 89 pages into a more digestible and functional document. Over the course of a number of intersessionals that took place in Bonn, Germany, the text grew smaller and smaller with cuts over time, and most recently the co-chairs of the UNFCCC process this year from the United States and from Algeria had the mandate to make a streamlined text, and this was released back in October, was cut down significantly, and then at the most recent Bonn intersessionals, these negotiations that Dyanna had just mentioned earlier, the text has grown a fair amount. So some of the things that had been cut have now been put back in. What we have now is a hybrid version between the co-chairs text and also some expansions from parties. It's 31 pages, and it still needs to be refined. And a lot of the sections are in brackets. What this means is that there are areas of contention between parties, and there are multiple options that are listed in the text. These are the areas that are going to be particularly hot topics and points of negotiation in the next few weeks in Paris. So with that context and background in mind, we're now going to be very upfront with you all and give you a bit of an overview of what SustainUS policy areas of focus are this year. Would you like to get that started, Dyanna?
Yeah. So the things that our delegation will be paying attention to the most, and we'll be highlighting these as they exist inside of the Paris Agreement as we go forward. The top priorities for our delegation are first, loss and damage, which Erica will give a deeper intro to, and then second one is the long-term goal, saying what is the overall vision of this agreement and what is the long-term trajectory that it's setting us on. And then the third piece is around equity and the provisions of the agreement that shape our climate change action in the context of human rights and the way that it's affecting people in different parameters of equity, as well as a piece of global justice saying how is it differentiated between countries. So those are our top priorities: equity, long-term goal, and loss and damage. And we'll be picking them out and highlighting them as they are inside the Paris text.
All right. So the Paris text is 31 pages, size 11, Times New Roman, extremely technical, and our objective here is to make this text a bit more digestible and slightly less jargon-filled. So bear with us as we move forwards with that goal. So diving into the draft treaty text, where we are right now. The very first section is the Preamble. This is where the principles of the agreement are outlined, the spirit of the deal, but this section is not legally binding, which is a very important thing to note. It's the big picture themes, like protecting the most vulnerable populations. This is where a lot of the equity language fits in. For instance, there's a section here, paragraph 10 of the preamble, that includes a lot of bracketed language, emphasizing the importance and respecting the needs of human rights, gender equality, women's empowerment, indigenous peoples, intergenerational equity concerns, the needs of migrants, IDPs, people in vulnerable situations, women, children, people with disabilities, etc. A lot of that text is in brackets, and it's still under negotiation. It's also interesting to note that this section has a lot of words that end in ing. For instance, reaffirming, endorsing, considering. So this is kind of broad, sweeping language that doesn't have any binding or legally committing nature to it. So rhetoric and language aside, the preamble is a pretty important place, but isn't where the bulk of the binding material of this treaty is located. Then Article 1 is the definitions. The UN has an obsession with acronyms, and this section is kind of tedious, but it's important to read because without this, the rest of the text doesn't make as much sense. Dyanna, would you like to kick off Article 2?
Yeah. Article 2. Article 2 has been one of my favorites to follow throughout the year, also because it switched names throughout this year. That Article 2 is called the purpose of the agreement, which is, it starts off with saying that the purpose of this agreement is to meet the objectives of the UNFCCC. And so to explain that further, and that conversation that's been playing out the rest of this year, is saying that this agreement will be fulfilling this commitment that we made in 1992. And that commitment, as it's written in the original 1992 text that created the UNFCCC, is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And so then what you see in this section, let's see if I can screen share, I think, yeah. So I put my screen onto, are you seeing the screen share of the text?
I'm seeing me.
Oh, darn, am I sharing you, Erica?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try again. No?
Hi.
No, it's, oh, I need to switch. Are you seeing it now? Oh, darn. Okay, well, I won't screen share. But so what you're seeing if you pull up the text, which is a good idea. I'm going to put that in the chat for those of you who are hanging out with us right now. I'm sorry I can't figure out screen share. I'm going to work on that next time I'm not talking. But you have this commitment.
I'll screen share the text.
Oh, great. So you have this commitment to uphold the commitment that was made in 1992. And then there's been a ton of discussion, obviously, over the years saying that that needs to go so much further. And you're further going into issues of, number one, is it 1.5 degrees or is it 2 degrees, is a top issue that will be closely followed during Paris throughout the entirety of this year. It's been talked about as either or in very not very much strong support for either one, but just everyone's just talking in this 1.5 or 2 degrees bubble. So that's one of the main points right below in the purpose section. And then, as Erica was saying, the equity language that a lot of people are looking out for exists right here at the bottom of this this section. And you can see at the end there saying that we will see our climate action with respect to protection and promotion and fulfillment of human rights, including the right to health and sustainable development, including the right of people under occupation, ensuring gender equality and the full and equal participation of women, and intergenerational equity. So obviously those words, intergenerational equity, are something that young people have been paying attention for years now, and is only there because of the effort of the lobbying of young people. And then also really important to note is option number 2, which is no text. And so as I was saying earlier, this section has taken a lot of heat throughout the year. At the August negotiation session, there's a lot of discussion around, should this have an objective? Is the original objective of this 1992 commitment strong enough? And countries, a lot of the developed countries, particularly the United States, said that they did not want to see an objective in the agreement. And so then when this document came out afterwards, it was after that round of negotiation, it switched words to purpose as a way to slightly mitigate some of the heated opinions around the objective, but obviously it didn't make it that far because the no text option came right back. So whether this stays in as a strong guide point of the agreement is in itself under question, and one of the things we're tracking in Paris. And going down, Erica, you want to scroll down a little bit in that agreement? So after that is Article 3. Article 3 is the mitigation section. And mitigation, quickly, is the effort to reduce the pace of climate change. It's essentially reducing greenhouse gas emissions with a few different components as well. And you can see the very first section in mitigation is the long-term goal, which in itself is significant to note that that has its own section right now in the agreement. All throughout this year, there's been a lot of chatter around the long-term goal that came from all different angles. And so you can see when you're looking at here in the agreement that there's a ton of different answers around the language of what this might take to have a long-term goal in the agreement. And that is saying, what is the commitment that is beyond the actual items of this agreement, but what is the vision of the world that we think needs to exist by 2050 or by the end of this century. And the big things to look out for when tracking the long-term goal are, first, the timeline. Is it 2050, is it 2060, 2070, 2080, or the end of the century? All of those numbers are right now in the agreement. The second thing to look out for understanding the long-term goal is it quantitative or is it qualitative? Since the last 2 rounds of negotiations, there's been a lot more momentum going towards a qualitative goal, something that is process-oriented and comes across as less of a strong commitment. These are things like decarbonization or even peaking years, things along those lines. And then the third thing is this: how is it referring to emissions specifically? The different options, as you can see here, is that there are net zero, there's zero, there's carbon emissions and decarbonization, and then all greenhouse gas emissions. So the way that we're talking about emissions is also something that will be determined by the long-term goal. And if you can see in here, that I just want to point out 2 of the more bold components and where they came from. The commitment to net zero or zero emissions by where is it, between 2016 and 2080. That came from the least developed countries and AOSIS, the Small Island States Alliance, and they together put that in. So that's one of the strongest proposals in there, and is the stronger end on the quantitative side. And then if you go right below where you're highlighting, Erica, you can see decarbonization by the end of the century. And that language was proposed by the United States. It was something that the EU was essentially trying to get into the agreement and was blocked by Poland, who is a major coal-producing nation. And so that language comes from the group of 7 major economies that agreed in June to a commitment to decarbonize the global economy by the end of the century. And so it essentially left the United States as the other G7 member who could put this in, and they proposed in the last round of negotiations to have that in the text because the word decarbonization had otherwise disappeared earlier. So that's something we're paying close attention to, and the ability to get a very strong and ambitious long-term goal is something that speaks very strongly to our movement and our work in SustainUS. So very interesting one that Paris will speak boldly to. And then otherwise in mitigation is one of the longest sections, and it gets very deep into the weeds. But the things to look out for is will there be a commitment to no backsliding, meaning that once you put forward a commitment, you can't take it back and make it any less. Another thing to look out for is an agreement to increase commitments over time. Can we get those words in there that says everyone must be doing more and more and more? And that's currently, both those are proposed right now. There's also the question of when these commitments should be updated. Do we revisit them every 5 years and continue to update or not? And then there's a large question around flexibility. So like developing countries and countries that are in more vulnerable positions, should they be given more flexibility to meet their commitments, and also proposals around if there's a disaster storm or things that inhibit fulfillment of commitments, what that should look like. So this idea of differentiation between who must be doing things and who must be doing the most, and then who needs the most flexibility is all throughout the mitigation section. Erica, off to you for Article 4.
All right. So Article 4 is adaptation. I'm scrolling down here, bear with me. So no matter how fast countries can strive to contain their emissions, some warming is guaranteed. This is inevitable at this point. So what can't be avoided must be managed, must be properly prepared for, so that adaptation is possible. Think about parts of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, small island developing states are already having to come to cope with intensifying weather conditions and extremes. Typhoon Haiyan that struck 2 years ago was a powerful example. So there has been some discussion about a long-term goal or vision that's adaptation-oriented to supplement and be in conjunction with the long-term goal that's mitigation-focused, which Dyanna just talked about. So this might be to increase resilience or reduce vulnerability. This is about guarding against climate shocks and measures like flood defenses, drought-resistant seeds. This is all focused on how do you adapt to the changes that are inevitable at this point. It's also worth noting that this section has a substantial human rights component. You can see here there's human rights language, equity language integrated into the adaptation section. So this is also a major issue is the gender equity component here. You can see in option 2 there's a section about gender responsive adaptation policies. This is something else that SustainUS has been working on through our equity campaign. Women are often the hardest hit. Women are often the most vulnerable groups. and thus adaptation should take those factors into consideration. This adaptation section is also a way to pressure the rich countries into helping to support the developing countries. References to continuous and enhanced international support and long-term, scaled-up, predictable finance offer some indication as to why developed nations are very, very, very conscious and wary about this section. Another plan that's been discussed is the inclusion of the 5-year adaptation plans as cycles, and this would potentially be running alongside the mitigation cycles that Dyanna talked about and that are in Article 3. So that's Article 4, adaptation. Now, there's another extremely important component here. The human story is that previously, many years ago, this agreement that stems from the COP process was only mitigation focused. Then there started to be an increased attention and focus in Cancun, and also a few other years, plus or minus, on the adaptation perspective. In Warsaw, most recently, a third pillar was brought to the table, which is loss and damage. So what happens when not only is mitigation not enough, not only is adaptation not enough, but there is losses and damages to countries because of climate impacts that have no other possible way to recover from. This could be compensation, this could be support in technical and other financial capacity. So this is rising sea levels forcing Pacific Islanders to leave their homes. This is droughts destroying livelihoods in sub-Saharan Africa. This is the realities that our planet is facing. In 2013, countries agreed to an international mechanism known as the Warsaw Mechanism, and a working group has started to meet and report on this matter, and their next meeting will be in 2016, so stay tuned for more information about that. However, it's important to note that the Warsaw Mechanism has limited international operational capacity. Its strengths are getting people to the table. Its strengths are in terms of compensation and moving money around. There has been some discussion of creating a climate change displacement coordination facility, which would help coordinate the efforts to address displaced people as a result of the extreme impacts of climate change. However, there's been a lot of skepticism about this this coordination facility because these are activities that are already taking place in other sections of the United Nations. For instance, OCHA, IOM, UNHCR, etc. At the same time, there's been a huge advocacy push to have this section included in the loss and damage mechanism in some capacity, because once that hook is there, then it sets the agenda for the years to come. So loss and damage is an extremely contentious issue. It's worth noting that there are two proposals on the table right now. This first proposal, which has been put forward, option 1, by G77, and a second section option, option 2, which just says no reference to loss and damage. This is the option that's been advocated for and supported by the United States, by some of the EU countries, and it's likely that these countries will reject anything that includes the compensation implication. This is a very divisive issue at the moment, and experts expect that it'll be running right until the final night. At the same time, they think, developing countries think that developed countries are not interested in accepting liability for these impacts. And it's extremely important that this is included in the Paris deal in some capacity. So sorry for running on about that a lot. It's worth noting that this has been one of SustainUS's focal areas for the year and will continue to be in Paris. On to you, Dyanna.
Thanks, Erica. Ooh, I'm echoing. I think in yours. I'm muting you. Okay. Uh, Great. So after loss and damage, we're into the sixth article of the agreement, which is finance. And absolutely one of the top issues that is on the table for Paris. And the two biggest questions that we're looking for to get out of this agreement is first, to see a clear pathway to 100 billion annual finance towards climate programs, climate adaptation, and mitigation. And that number, 100 billion, comes from the 2009 pledge that developed countries committed to see happen before 2020. And where we are right now, I actually don't even know the number because I know that it's just so low, far below 100 billion. The United States has committed 3 billion, and China has committed, I think, 3.1 billion. But even these commitments are still in very fuzzy phase. The United States is totally gridlocked in Congress as to what the fate of that commitment will be. And there's also been, you'll hear this conversation around new and additional climate finance has become a very important way to phrase this, because there's also been an understanding of recategorizing the finance flows that are already in existence. So the OECD put out a report this year that said, hey, no, actually there's like 62 billion that's already in climate finance. We're more than halfway there, but has received a lot of criticism as it is counted a lot of overseas development aid as part of climate finance, and perhaps that it will be considered in some way part of the climate finance flows, but there's this big push that's saying we need new and additional funds, and that's not just recategorizing the development aid that's already in existence. So that's clarity point number one, is this pathway to 100 billion before 2020 that we're looking for in this section. And the second one is what happens after 2020. You can see in I'm not sure if you'll be able to pick it out from scrolling where you are, Erica, but that there's mentions in proposals within the agreement that financial resources shall be scaled up from a floor of 100 billion per year for 2020 onward, and saying that absolutely no lower than this, but we need to go much higher. And to secure that in the agreement, to see financial flows increase once the agreement takes in effect, is a point that's worth watching for finance. And going then into Article 7 is in a similar category, same category of support for support within the agreement, and that's the technology transfer. And technology transfer deals with access to green energy technologies, with energy efficiency technologies, and all those more technical bits that need to be facilitated to actually see this transition happen to a 100% renewable world. And it largely is a finance article in disguise, saying that it is a lot about finance access to overcome barriers over intellectual property rights and who has access to technology. So finance and technology transfer are very, very often looped together as these two parts of the puzzle. And so I'm not going to go too much deeper into Article 7. I'm not going to lie that my knowledge is not so much there, but just paying attention to how that's connected to finance is an important thing going to Paris. Back to you, Erica. Oh, I need to unmute you. I'm sorry. Oh, can you unmute yourself? Erica!
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Excellent. And can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Great. So Article 8 is capacity building. If you thought that the finance and fairness sections were over, that's not necessarily true. Article 8 is about those same concepts, but in a slightly different frame. It's about the skills and institutions that are required to put climate plans into action. So without assistance, developing countries, developing nations will not be able to develop the plans that are needed for green economies, to protect citizens from future impacts, and also to measure, verify, and report on their emissions. This measurement, verification, and reporting is known as MRV. So this section here asks to include enhance stability and capacity in all areas on climate change for developing country parties, facilitate access to finance, technology, transparent access to communication. This is this section right here. And again, there are a few options here, option 1, option 2, option 3, and option 4. It all keeps going. Another suggestion is more focused on the financial mechanism. So there are varying degrees to which this Article 8 will have specific components that deal with technology and communication and other topics. And there's also certain proposals that are just focused on the financial dimensions. Again, this is another finance article that's somewhat masked. There's also a possibility to launch an international capacity building mechanism. So the people who are, the groups that are majorly in support of this article are the Africa group and G77 plus China. Again, this article is one that's been more supported by the non-EU and developed country parties. Moving on to Article 9, which is transparency. So this is super important. In October, this section expanded from just a half a page in the co-chairs revisions, which I talked about earlier, to 3 whole pages. The launch of the MRV system that I just talked about could be one of the major achievements from the conference, which would allow the world to have means to assess what countries are doing what in a comparable way. The proposals here indicate that it's extremely important that this respects the different capabilities of the wealthy, emerging, and developed countries. The idea is similar to common but differentiated responsibility. Different countries have different capabilities in this area. There's also a suggestion for a system of transparency for action and one for support. Again, individual submissions are interesting here. There could be a possibility of a grace period for developing countries to get up to speed. They're not expected to have the same level as the developed countries overnight in terms of transparency. So there's sort of this push and this pull. Developing in the emerging economies say that transparency measures should look at where the money is coming from, while the developed countries are focused more heavily on transparency for emissions. Again, this is another topic that will be negotiated in Paris and is also still up in the air. All right, back to you, Dyanna. Can you unmute yourself? Dyanna?
Hey, I'm back. How are we doing? Is it my turn?
Your turn.
Okay, great. Thanks. I hope your section went well on transparency and capacity. Definitely missed all that. Great. Global Stocktake. Okay, global Stocktake is just a word for a global meeting. The global Stocktake has been, in my personal opinion, one of the saddest sections of the agreement to watch over this year, because it's just, and also coming out of the last COP in Lima, has just continually gotten steadily weaker at every single meeting. But the idea last year when we were in Lima was that we need something that is a equity-based, science-based review of all of these commitments that everyone is making. So maybe we didn't say already, and most of you probably do know that the base of the Paris Agreement is these individual commitments made by every single country. And so this global Stocktake is largely to address that and say, hey, how's everything adding up? And throughout the earlier part of this year, there's a big push to have an individual evaluation, meaning every single country would be evaluated on their commitments every 5 years. And you can see within the wording of where it is now that the words are overall, aggregate, and collective, and you can choose one of those for the purpose of this meeting. Yeah, I guess heading there. And so it's going to be essentially just saying what's everything adding up to on a very broad level, and that's good in itself. But it does lack this other piece that is individual reviews. So I think you can look to see where that's coming from in civil society. A lot of organizations outside the space are doing that kind of review on their own, but it won't be so neatly tucked away into this agreement. And so the things to look out for then in this section in particular are what will actually end up being included. That will this only be a review of mitigation actions, or will there also be a push to evaluate finance? There's a proposal in this section saying that financial commitments should also be evaluated at the stocktake. And then the other thing to look out for is the start year. You can see in there now that there's a proposal for 2023 and 2024 as a start year. And then will that be every 5 years after that? Is it a cycle that sets up? And another part of the agreement, which talks about before 2020, we're looking to see if that will actually come through to have a review that starts before 2020. In 2018, I know the French presidency is pushing for that, and there's good support to see a review before 2020. So that would connect this whole 5-year cycles of review. And after that, Article 11 is implementation and compliance. And obviously coming out of the Kyoto Protocol, that there's a big fear of people leaving the agreement, and a more refined effort to pay attention to what that means to be part of this agreement and what it means to be to leave if that happens. And so the big concerns are how to ensure that developed countries absolutely follow through on the commitments that they've made, and then on the other side of that coin is how to support developing countries to be able to participate. And that goes back to these finance and technology questions that we have been talking about earlier, but making sure that their processes and institutions are set up in place to see that through. And then the third big issue is how to deal with non-compliance. So there's a couple of bold proposals throughout this section, including saying that, hey, if you're going to leave this agreement, you have to make a declaration of non-compliance. That's one of the options in there right now of saying that you have to tell the world that you're leaving, which is a pretty bold thing to ask for. Other things that are being proposed in this section are to create a list of consequences, so that there is, when we sign this agreement at the end of Paris, that there's a list of consequences for folks who leave. So not too much excitement in this section, but definitely one that will have more refined details sorted out.
All right, so you're probably thinking, oh no, we've only been through 11 articles. There's still so many more before 26. Well, you're in luck, because Articles 12 through 16 in particular are quite dull. I'm going to spare you the bulk of this. It's all about institutional arrangements. It's addressing the question, who is the conference of parties, who and what institutions are necessary to carry out this treaty. Article 12 is CMA, Article 13 is Secretariat, 14 is SUBSTA and SBI. You can see here SUBSTA is the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, and then SBI is the subsidiary body for implementation. Article 15 is the bodies and institutional arrangements for this agreement. 16 is about signature, instruments of ratification, acceptance, approval, and accession. It's all about how do the states that are party to this agreement actually make that type of a commitment. And this is very much legal jargon. Article 17 is quite interesting in the sense that it poses further requirements. This is the question about whether any country that hasn't submitted a climate plan can become a party to the agreement. And I think Venezuela is an example of a country that has not submitted a climate plan. So if this passes and isn't deleted, isn't option 2, which is no further requirement, that means Venezuela can't be a part of can't be a part of this agreement. Article 18 is entry into force. So this is addressing the question, when would an agreement come into force? There are plenty of options on the table, but it's unlikely to be earlier than January 1st of 2020. So that means there's no deal for 5 years between 2015 and 2020. That means there are other, well, it's worth noting that there are other pre-2020 conversations that are taking place outside of the scope of this agreement. So this is one part of this treaty that's actually quite clear. There will be no deal for 5 years between now and then in this agreement. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Dyanna, but I think that's accurate. Okay, then Article 19 through 26 are even less interesting than the ones I just described. 19 is amendments, 20 is annexes, 21 is the settlement of disputes, 22 is voting, 23 is depositary, 24 is reservations. Note that there are no reservations made to this agreement at the moment, but it's placeholder. 25 is withdrawal, 26 are languages. All of the United Nations languages are indicated there. So there you go. That's a wrap. I'm going to go back to screen sharing our presentation. Any questions? Unless, Dyanna, do you have anything to add there? Dyanna? Hey, Dyanna. Dyanna, are you still on? All right, well, in any case, I'm going to go to the questions. I think Diana's internet might have cut out. So, Talia Schmidt asks if this webinar will be recorded. Yes, it certainly will be, and it'll be shared as soon as this is over. It'll also be available on a YouTube channel. Will we be providing updates on a regular basis? Asks Beth Mercer-Taylor. Yes, we will be providing updates throughout the time that we are at COP. There is a link on the SustainUS website that provides a bit of a summary of what SustainUS will be doing on the ground, and also has a link that you can sign up for if you want daily updates from our delegation. Dyanna, are you back on?
I am back. I'm so sorry.
Welcome.
How's it going?
It's good.
I'm so glad this is recorded.
Some Q&A. Can you see the Q&A?
Nope.
Okay, well, I'm just going to keep asking the questions, and if you want to chime in with some answers, that would be wonderful.
Oh, I can see it now. Oh, this is fun. Hi, everyone. Okay, great.
So I just addressed the first two questions regarding recording the webinar and updates while we're at COP.
Did you give action steps yet?
Nope, we're still in the Q&A section.
Okay, thanks.
So another question was from Talia Schmidt. Can you clarify what you mean by Article 18? There will be no deals made for 5 years. So this is only about what is in this Paris Agreement. And Dana, correct me if I'm wrong. This Paris Agreement is starting in 2020, correct?
Yeah, so Eric and I have only talked about what you'll hear as called Workstream 1, and if you follow the negotiations as they start happening in the next 2 weeks, you'll hear Workstream 1 and Workstream 2. And as I said, this came out of a 2011 decision to have this agreement, and at that time in 2011, they established 2 work streams. The first one was to build this part of the agreement that starts in 2020, And Workstream 2 is what will be decided between 2015 and 2020. And that is so important and something you need a whole nother webinar to dig into. But Workstream 2 is its whole set of issues. It's going to have its own text that comes out also in Paris, and a process that a ton of people are following very closely and is very essential for setting up what's possible for this agreement and the entire wave of ambition that we're built off of. So that part of the 2015 to 2020 will all be covered in the Workstream 2 part. And there's also like a draft, just same as there's a draft text out right now that Eric and I just walked through, there's also a draft decision out on that Workstream 2 part that you can dig into online.
Excellent. So I'm reading other questions here. Beth asks, she says, thank you for this. Very helpful presentation, SustainUS. For those of us going to Paris, does SustainUS have plans to meet up? We have 10 from Minnesota attending weeks 1 and 2. Yes, we have many plans. There is a there's a convergence of youth called COI that takes place before the start of COP, and that'll be one major meetup of US youth. But there will also be a multiplicity of opportunities to meet up while we're in Paris during COP itself. So Beth, I'd encourage you to reach out to our delegation leaders, Dyanna and Maria, and we'll be able to set something up if you'd like to meet. Do you want to take the next question, Dyanna?
What's the next one?
Is there any way to tell from similar documents which countries are responsible for which options or alternative texts? Or is this just known through word of mouth or folklore? Thank you, Jeff Stanley.
Yes. So it's all in the wild world of the UNFCCC website. Everything actually is public, and how this kind of works, and specifically the document that we just went through, that one came out of the last round of negotiations, where we started with a document that was written entirely by the two co-chairs of the process, taking from their knowledge of working with countries throughout the year, their best guess at like where the middle line is. And then countries submitted proposals into that, so you have these different proposals that come directly from countries, and they're all also written, and there's an online portal that they go through, so you have all these just, sometimes they're really formal and proper, and other times they're super simple, you know, maybe 2 sentences of text that you can see that come from all the different countries. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to navigate, I'd say, on your own, but we can share, we'll send out a follow-up email to this webinar with some key resources, and I personally use this one document that a lot of civil society organizations were tracking together, and so we have about 200 in Excel, or not Excel, just a big chart with like 200 columns on it from all the different proposals that went in and what they are proposing. So they do come from specific countries or country groups. Most often it is groups, and they are online public, but incredibly difficult to track down if you're starting, I think, at this point and trying to work backwards from what's in the text.
Great. Moving on to the next question. Also, this one's from Dyanna Reedshaw.
Oh, Indy, hi.
Hey, since LNG will next be discussed in 2016, how does it relate to Paris this year? So right now the question is loss and damage going to be included as an independent article? That's the ideal situation. The second option is that it's somehow merged into the adaptation article, which a lot of countries, particularly developing and small island nations, are extremely against. And the third option is that there's no mention of L&D at all. So right now, the big push is to get it included as its own article, and to get it included with the technical and the financial support mechanisms that we discussed earlier, including the Climate Displacement Coordination Facility. Is SustainUS tracking it this year? Yeah, we're tracking it, but we're also pushing to make sure that it's firmly anchored in the text with those components. The next question is from Adam Haas. Dyanna, do you know anything about the French option of producing white papers for deep emissions pathways by 2050?
No, Adam, I don't know any more than what's in that question. But I will say, I mean, there's a lot of awesome analyses being thrown around of how is this possible and what do deep decarbonization pathways look like. And I think that's what you mean by deep emissions pathways. I've always heard them deep decarbonization pathways. And I would encourage you to come to the training at COI with us on the first day, which will be an introduction to the long-term goal and the different support behind that, which we will get into the different pathways and these analyses that are coming up to support that. So while you're in Paris, come to our training.
Great. So the next question is also from Jeff Stanley. Is there any capacity left in Paris to discuss the extent of compensation for L&D, or is it all or nothing? Ha ha ha. Yes, there is some capacity to discuss the extent of compensation. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a bargaining chip. A lot of the experts who I've heard talk about this have said it's likely going to be one of the very, very, very last things that's negotiated, and it's probably going to be it'll probably be included in the agreement, but with no compensation at all. At least that's what people from the United States seem to be suspicious of. So I don't really know if that answers your question. There is capacity to discuss, and it's certainly something that a lot of people are pushing for. The likelihood of it passing is still up in the air, but it's worth pushing for.
I just pasted, can everyone see the chat box? Is that a thing that's available to everyone?
No, I think it's just available to me, Dyanna.
Oh, really? Well, I wish I could send that out, but I just pasted a teleconference text from Todd Stern, which is the Special Envoy for Climate Change from the United States negotiation team. And I think it's to understand compensation, loss, and damage, and the hard lines that's up against is he essentially, in very clear English, lays out that the United States will absolutely not agree to compensation. So the ways that will exist are very, you have two very hard red lines that are coming forward, which is that one in the clearest way that what the United States has been saying for the entirety of this year is absolutely no, and then a very clear red line coming from incredible leadership of a lot of developing countries saying that that's also our red line, and so someone's going to have to give to have this agreement come through. So it's going to be tough. It's be a very interesting issue in Paris.
So with our final 2 minutes here, Dyanna, do you want to talk a bit about what the next steps are? It seems like we've answered all the questions, so maybe it's a good time to talk about moving forwards to Paris.
Yeah, definitely. So for people coming to Paris, we'd say join us at COI and engage with YOUNGO, the Youth Constituency of the United Nations. All of these issues that we've been digging into the most the deepest, socially loss and damage, long-term goal, intergenerational equity, and human rights, those pieces in the negotiations, they all have international coalitions of young people who are working to track that and push for that in negotiations. And all of those groups of young people will be leading introduction sessions at COI to jump involved in that. And so I'd say for those of you on your way to Paris, absolutely join us there. And secondly, though it may seem a little off-fitting if it wasn't already what you're considering, I would really encourage all of you to engage in media production. The world is going to be paying attention to Paris, and whether you're coming to Paris or you're not coming to Paris, your connection to climate work is the time to be elevated. Right now is the time to elevate that work, and any small piece that connects to the Paris Treaty that you can grab onto and show how that's connected to local solutions and the work that we're doing in our communities is really a great time, and local media outlets are looking for that opportunity to connect. So I would say go for that. And coming from SustainUS, my third ask is to stay tuned. we'll be launching an international campaign to push for a strong long-term goal at COI. And so that will go live on our website on Thursday. And it will be a large photo petition and a Twitter campaign that you can join really easily and join this momentum to show a huge vibrant support for a strong signal in Paris to phase out carbon emissions by 2050 and have this commitment to put an end date to dirty energy. And there's a lot of really good energy from young people around the world that are ready for this. So it's something I'm really excited for, to go into Paris, and a great thing to join online. So would love to have all of you join us there. Any next steps on your thoughts, Erica?
No, I think that was quite comprehensive. I would say that if you haven't followed SustainUS on Twitter, you should do so. Also on Facebook, and as I mentioned earlier, there will be a daily updates from our delegation, and it would be great if you all could sign up for that. And also, there's going to be so much energy and excitement and momentum around this conference that needs to be cultivated, it needs to be embraced, but it also needs to continue beyond Paris. So if you can come and bring all the energy, and then if you can't, or even if you are coming and then you return to your communities, make sure that the momentum and the energy is continued beyond 2015 into the indefinite future.
Yeah, great. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining. We're a minute over the hour, so we'll hop off now, but this was quite fun, and be in touch. Happy to talk more.
Bye.
Bye.